Hey guys, George here again. This time, let's talk about the data-driven procedural infinite world in Wayward Terran Frontier. So, when it comes to procedural infinite worlds these days, the sort of popular technique amongst, well, procedural infinite world games these days is to divide the world into chunks, which is kind of what I've done here. You see the grids. And as the player approaches a new chunk, the game goes in a worker thread, outside the main game thread. It goes and it uses an algorithm that generally samples some Perlin simplex noise or fractal noise or some noise function, essentially, in order to procedurally generate the next chunk. And then it stitches all the chunks together so that what you see is the final result, which just looks like a infinite procedural world. I kind of use a different technique. Well, I kind of use the same technique, but it's different in one important way. So I still have the infinite grid, and the grid isn't technically infinite, but the boundaries in the positive and negative direction is essentially a 32-bit integer. I guess it could be very easily upgraded to a 64-bit integer, but I just haven't bothered because of how ridiculously huge a 32-bit integer is and how long it would take you to ever get to the edge. I don't think it would ever be possible as it is, because there's a lot of these grids. The inside of an individual grid is actually much bigger than it typically is in chunk-based games. The actual dimensions of a single grid, if you will, are the precision limit. They're based on the limitations of precision of 16-bit floating point vectors. In a 16-bit floating point vector, you're probably thinking, hey, that's tiny, why not use, 32-bit or even 64-bit? And the answer is, one, I don't need it, because the chunks are already massive as they are, and it wouldn't make sense to make them any bigger, because then the time to generate an individual one of them would be ridiculous, and I'd have to generate more. And with 16-bit, I keep the sort of the memory constraint and the generation constraint and the rendering constraints of the individual sector down to a minimum. So what's cool about the generation of individual grids, and let me go over to where my actual character is that unlike a lot of games where it's a single algorithm that generates a continuous terrain across every grid, the generation algorithm in Wayward Terran Frontier goes out for every individual grid into the extensions directory, and it looks for the custom script needed to generate that particular grid. What this means is that if a mod maker wants to modify the map of the game world, as we've done here for the star system that consists the single-player game of Zero Falls, you can go on an individual sector-by-sector basis and completely rewrite the script that generates an individual sector with whatever algorithm you want. And that script allows you to specify the full three-dimensional scene in the backdrop, so every aspect of what the player sees in the background, the backdrop images, the shaders used to render everything, any objects that'll be there in like the 3D parallax, everything. And so even the 3D planets that you see that we've recently added that rotate in real time and have fancy parallax mapping and everything, bump mapping, the nice procedural planets you see, those are actually an extension that we wrote using the extension API that will be available to every modder that wants to make a mod for Wayward Terran Frontier. It's all just using the same background extension, whatever. But in addition to making the actual art of how things look in the backdrop, extensions also are responsible for placing all of the terrain items. So asteroids, the layout and type of asteroids, the patterns that you get, distribution based on whatever, on noise sampling. You can make the layout of a sector work however you want in every individual sector. So when I say that the universe is procedurally generated, what I mean is that we've built a bunch of these extensions to be used by default everywhere in the galaxy. This is an example of sort of what the game generates when left to its own devices. And over here is an example of what the game generates when you hand place your own algorithm for every individual sector. So, we've got the warm, sort of orange sector, and the gray, spooky, and less colorful sector, and then the scary pirate red sector, and then the cold blue ice sectors, and different variations of each one. All of those placed by hand, using different algorithms for the layout of asteroids and everything. So, but just placing asteroids would be boring, so for this latest patch, what I'm working on is another system, which is prefabs. So the individual items that we'll be able to find in sectors can be just regular terrain items like this asteroid, and they of course come with, per pixel collision detection, so you can shoot them and so you can crash into them and die horrible deaths. They also allow you to specify like what type of ore will be in them if you drill into them and to go inside them to mine them for resources. But all of that is stuff that comes from outside the game, essentially from what would be the equivalent of a script. I'm going to take a short detour and talk about scripting in languages. So, Wayward Terran Frontier is built on the .NET platform. It used to be built on XNA. We've since moved over to monogame so that we can have modern DirectX shaders, and so that we can have 64-bit .NET, because we really do use the 64-bit, not for the positions of ships, but we use it for memory, because when you have the interior of every ship mapped in the entire universe with the crew walking around inside and calculating damage on a per tile basis, it ends up using a lot of memory. We actually do take advantage of more than 2 gigs of RAM, and we keep it pretty much under 3 gigs, but since mod makers can in theory add whatever they want, it could potentially use all of your RAM. That's why we needed 64-bit, that's why we're on monogame, among other reasons. The other advantage of .NET, though, is that .NET is an interpreted language, kind of. It doesn't interpret every individual line of code, because your code does get compiled to a bytecode, but the bytecode doesn't run on your computer, it runs on a .NET virtual machine. And so that means that no matter what physical machine the game is running on, the code itself is always technically running on a virtual machine inside a controlled sandboxed environment, which means that things are predictable and code can interact in really cool ways. And what this means for modding support is that a game that's written in like C++, that compiles directly to machine code, if it wants to bring any type of code or scripts or a mod material, stuff written by other people, if it wants to bring that in from outside the game to coexist inside the game environment, what it has to do is it has to implement a scripting API. So you've heard of like Lua or something. That's essentially game code which reads in external code in the form of like strings and then parses it into functions and maps those functions to internal game functions to do everything. For one, it's not as fast, and for two, it's really difficult to build, so you end up with a lot of limitations on what you can do with it. But with .NET, we have reflection, and reflection is really great from a developer perspective, because it allows me, as the developer, to say in my code, hey, every time you load a new sector, so say you're going to go over there, every time you load a new sector, go out into the extensions directory and find a DLL that contains the code written for that sector. And that code can be written by anyone who's programming in C# on .NET, and so that code can fully define everything about how that sector generates, because all the game code, all the Wayward Terran Frontier code does is it just calls your function. It presents an interface for you to implement, so it knows how your code is going to work, so long as you sort of write inside the lines of the interface framework, and within that framework your code can do whatever it wants to generate the sector. So that means that our mod API can also, allow mod developers to place absolutely every object in a sector however they want. And the most exciting thing about this patch is that we've created yet another new tool that's built on top of the extension framework. So it's built inside the existing extensions system. It's technically just a mod for the Wayward Terran Frontier engine, but what it does is it makes these things, which are prefabs. So this over here is a hand-mapped game section. Sorry, it's kind of loud. I've used my sort of, okay, you know what, I'm being shot at by a turret here, give me a second. I'm gonna hide behind a rock. I've used my in-house map-making tool that I wrote myself to produce this area of the... Stop shooting me, I'm trying to make a video here, damn it. I'm gonna hide carefully. There we go. I should be safe there, I think. Nope, not safe there. Even slightly closer without hitting it. Don't want to crash. There we go. Fun. Okay, so I used an in-house map-making tool. I selected which sort of textures, which objects I wanted to use, and I just hand-placed all of these items. And then I go into the extension, and I select the backdrop, which generates this whole sector, and I just tell it, okay, take this list of prefabs that I've hand-mapped, and place them randomly wherever. Pick how many of them to place, pick where to place them, randomly rotate them, switch them up with some of the scripts that I've programmed into the prefab itself, and the result is you get this big, cool sort of complex that is much more interesting than just having, an asteroid here and there, because it can have choke points, it can have turrets that shoot at you, it can have bad guys that spawn, and what you'll see is at the center of this thing there's actually a station there, and so if I can navigate and get to the station, which maybe I'll try now, although I'm only half paying attention, there's a really high chance that I'll just get blown up. If you can get to the station, of course, it's full of bad guys and loot, so essentially what I've created is a space dungeon, and that I have to navigate and get past all of the bad guys in order to... Oh man, I am so not going to make it. But if you navigate this maze sort of thing and manage to get to the station, then you get to explore it and collect loot. I mean, it's a space dungeon crawler is essentially what we've made. But, and yeah, that's going to be the end of that. Oh man. And all of my engines are gone. I don't have any thrusters, I don't have anything. So, well, I think you get the idea. You're gonna have to actually fight your way in as opposed to just trying to fly in, which makes things a bit more interesting to players who want to explore the actual game world. But that's the big new feature. Well, what I consider to be probably the biggest new feature of this upcoming patch is that the stuff in the actual game world is going to be replaced. Not replaced, but it's going to include prefabs. And so space is going to get a lot more interesting, and we're going to use the prefab system to make all sorts of cool maps. And the idea is that eventually, once we're satisfied with where that prefab creating mapping tool is, we'll be able to release it to the community, and then players will be able to go into the game and make their own maps. The system is such that with the tools, you'll be able to... well, let me spawn a ship real quick. I don't really need to, but I want to stare at the map while I'm talking about all this. Actually, I can just go to this console over here. Let's just go to this, because this is technically a turret console attached to nothing, but it lets me look at stuff and spawn the map. That means basically with the prefab system, you'll be able, as a mod maker, if you want to in the future, go into the existing single-player game and say, you know what, the single-player game is great, I want to leave it as is, but if the player wants to play my mod, they can just fly over to, I don't know, this system, and I'm going to replace all of the content in this system with my own extensions for generating these individual sectors. And then I'm gonna write prefabs, which will be all sorts of cool dungeons, and I want my prefabs to spawn randomly in asteroid belts over here. I want to spawn some cool mega fortress next to this planet over here. I'm going to completely remove this planet and replace it with, you know, my own art for a destroyed looking planet, whatever. Point is, it's a procedural infinite universe, but with complete control over what spawns in the universe, so that you can essentially overwrite any aspect of the procedural generation with your own stuff, which you can control at any level. Prefabs you can have a single prefab that just fills the entire volume of a single sector, or you can have prefabs that just spawn randomly in a generated sector, or you can even go into existing sectors like the ones I've added or the ones that exist as part of the game and say, hey, you know, every now and then in one of these asteroid belts that spawns already all over the world, just take my prefab and randomly seed it into the world somewhere. And so the cool space complexes that you created will start showing up in the game all over the map. So on the one hand, it's kind of a mod-making utility, but on the other hand, it's also the utility that we're using to make the game of Wayward Terran Frontier Zero Falls. So everything in Zero Falls is going to be built using the same tools that eventually mod makers will have for, you know, making the whole universe. So that's, you know what, that's the whole thing. That's everything with prefabs. I really need to stop talking now, but like I've told you in the past, these videos are unscripted, and so I think I've covered everything, and I hope that you enjoyed the video, and maybe later I'll show you the process that you go through for actually making a prefab, but it's pretty simple, and it's fancy and awesome, and I'm gonna make a sandwich later today, because I like sandwiches. So thanks for watching, and I'll talk to you later.